like in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. They're there, and they're braying. They're either angry, excited, bobbing about in some strange way. They relate to the earlier London mobs who went to trials and wanted to see people hanged and torn to pieces and burnt in Smithfield. You know, it's that kind of sense, except that the theatre where it now happens is a music hall. So he gets that, which is the savagery of the imperial city. I think certain painters have that ability to be anticipating the future, and inevitably the horror is going to come at the end. It's Conrad again, it's the horror of the horror, and Eliot again, you know, the dead amongst us. Who would have thought so many had been undone? All of those feelings are there in these paintings.
Before the end of the 19th century, Sickert had established himself as a fiercely original painter. It caused trouble with his old mentor, Whistler, who hated an upstart. Irritation on both sides soon boiled over. Sickert used his column in the Speaker to fire a volley at one of Whistler's most pompous and boring acolytes, a man named Joseph Purnell. Purnell had produced a series of lithographs, which Sickert said weren't true lithographs. It was a snide attack and it was a technicality, but it misfired. Egged on by Whistler, Purnell took Sickert to court and won £50 in damages. Whistler's response? Enemy met and destroyed. Sickert in ambulance. Sickert put a brave face on it. In 1895, he sailed for the continent. In Venice, Ellen discovered a letter from his mistress, Ada. The artist's response? To start another affair. Sickert claimed to be a passionate believer in marriage, although he also seems to have been pathologically unfaithful. And as news filtered through to Venice of yet more of his infidelities, he confessed to Ellen that he'd lived the life of an adulterer and couldn't imagine living any other. I wonder if he was alive to the irony that his marriage was falling apart in the city of perpetual disintegration. By September 1896, Sickert's marriage to Ellen was over. The artist was unsurprised, but devastated. The mask momentarily slipped in a self-portrait. He looks wearily over his shoulder, as if hounded or haunted by his past. Red-rimmed eyes, face both made and destroyed by thick brushstrokes. Startlingly modern, painted in 1896. Sickert was alone in Venice and found a convenient refuge: his work. When Sickert came to Venice, he knew very well that he was following in the footsteps of some of the most famous painters who'd ever lived: Canaletto, Turner, Monet. And you might have expected him to steer clear of the scenes they'd made famous, but he didn't. He painted the Grand Canal, he painted the facade of St. Mark's. It's as if he knew that if he painted what he saw, filtered through his sensibility, something new and different would emerge. And he was right. Sickert's Venice is unlike any other. The facade of St. Mark's, viewed square on. Same motif, same framing, by day or beneath a red sky at night. The facade, designed to look splendid, now ragged and worn, failing to hide the reality. Venice was a piece of failed theatre, barely afloat. Another turn gone sour. Sickert's Venetian views sold well. But by 1903, the artist had painted every drowned inch of Kilburn in the sea, as he liked to call Venice. Bad weather forced him indoors, behind the crumbling walls lapped by water, where the glamorous myth of Venice was belied by whorehouse reality. A number of prostitutes became his sitters in Venice. They modelled for him in his lodgings at the Calle dei Frati. He may also have paid them to sleep with him. He confessed to Jacques-Émile Blanche that he'd caught the clap in Venice. Now, he wrote rather bitterly, now I'm a grown-up. La Giuseppina, bird's nest perched on her head, wild eyes, pained expression. Her mother, Mamma mia poveretta, haggard and vacant, a husk where there was once life. Raw, unvarnished images of women, transcriptions of tough lives. Sickert had spent 10 years on the continent, away from London and its rather provincial art world. He'd found his own places, above all Dieppe and Venice, his own subjects, and his own style of painting. Now, in 1905, he was ready to return. Sickert set sail for Britain, in no mood for settling down. To him, fashionable London reeked of the stale whiff of the establishment. So Sickert rented rooms not in Chelsea, but around Fitzroy Street and Camden Town, the wrong side of the tracks. Prostitutes were hired as models. Foxed mirrors, cheap dresses, metal bedsteads. His drab lodgings supplied the props. Sickert stage managed a series of pictures, the Camden Town nudes, that laid bare the underbelly of British life. A dingy back end, soiled sheets, bilious light, a woman sinking into a soft mattress, devoured by the tools of her own trade. Dawn, Camden Town, another iron bedstead. Naked woman, clothed man crumpled at the foot of the bed. Modern life divested, a tawdry reality laid bare. If you want to understand just how daring and original Sickert was as a painter of the human form, above all a painter of the nude, it's a good idea to compare him with his contemporaries. This is a picture by Lawrence Alma-Tadema done in 1909. Alma-Tadema was the master of the tasteful classical nude, and here we see two rather English-looking gals titillatingly disporting themselves in a pool of Pompeian water. A very different pond over here. This is Sickert's La Hollandaise, a woman, a naked woman, in her bed. There's nothing idealized, remote, fantastical, imaginary about this body. It's a real person. I see this as a representation of all of us. The human animal alone, caged within the basic parameters of life, in this case, the bed. It's a picture of an ungainly woman being herself in her own space, in her own time, and no one else in Britain had painted that.
Human beings are such strange, complex creatures. There's a feeling that we're not quite at ease with ourselves in our animal skin. That whether we're dressed or nude, there's a sense of awkwardness about us. And I think this is something that Sickert captures very, very tenderly.
Artist Celia Paul's fascination with Sickert goes back to her time at the Slade School of Art in the mid-70s. She paints only sitters she knows intimately, mostly women, in her home and studio in central London.
I think there's a compassion in the way he portrays women, an intimacy. There's a real sense of his charm throughout. I mean, these women are delighted to be sitting for him. I mean, you get the feeling that they actually love being looked at by him. They're erotic feelings in the best sense of the word. Even though there's a kind of intimate drama in all of the interiors, there is a kind of really quite desolate, lonely feeling. I sort of imagine him looking in through the window at something that he hasn't got. And he's decided, obviously, that a domestic life is probably something that may be too complicated for him.
Sickert in his 40s was the oldest enfant terrible on the block. He preferred the juvenile lead and wrote a manifesto for his own dirty realism with typical gusto. The more our art is serious, the more will it tend to avoid the drawing room and stick to the kitchen. The plastic arts are gross arts, dealing joyously with gross material facts. While they will flourish in the scullery or on the dunghill, they fade at a breath from the drawing room. Sickert in his latest incarnation didn't just rattle teacups, he smashed them to smithereens. Worse than slum art, worse than prostitution, wrote one critic. And Sickert, well, he revelled in the furore, all publicity being good publicity. And no subject was off limits. Sickert's Camden Town was drab and grimy, home to the migrant workforce of navvies responsible for building most of North London's network of railways. It wasn't a kind place, and it could be a violent one. In the early hours of the morning of the 12th of September 1907, the body of Emily Dimmock, a local prostitute, was found sprawled on her bed. Her throat had been cut so deeply her head had almost been severed. There was blood on the sheets, blood on the floor, more blood in the wash basin near the bed and on her petticoat, which the murderer had used to wipe his hands clean after committing the killing. It was a sad and horrible end to a young woman's life, which the press instantly banner headlined, "The Camden Town Murder." Sickert was gripped by the lurid press coverage of the crime, and as he said years later, murder is as good a subject as any other. This is one of Sickert's most daring and ambitious pictures. A small interior. But what does it show us? Well, we see a naked woman, or more precisely, we see half a naked woman lying on a bed. Beside her is a man, but he's almost a shadow, a smear. He's totally indeterminate. You can't see his face, his features. The picture's a puzzle. And as if to play with his audience's narrative expectations, Sickert exhibited it under no less than 3 different titles. The first time, he simply called it Summer Afternoon. Second time around, borrowing a phrase from a music-hall song that possibly alludes to prostitution, What Shall We Do About the Rent? And last of all, he exhibited it with a group of other pictures under the umbrella title, The Camden Town Murder. And I think the important thing about all of those 3 titles is that none of them fits. How could it possibly be the Camden Town Murder? Yes, there's a basin on the table behind, but there's no sign of a weapon. There's no blood. There's no evidence that the woman is dead. I think that what Sickert actually attempted in this picture is to paint a fragment of modern reality that seems as full of doubt and uncertainty as he felt reality at every moment to be. He's painting the way in which existence is perpetually a mystery, and he wants to create a picture that is perpetually mysterious as life itself. The Camden Town murder pictures